Greetings everyone. Okay friends, so we're heading into our final part of David Lynn and his claims towards Seventh-day Adventist theology. And as I usually say, if you haven't watched the previous parts, it will all make sense if you watch those first before you watch this one, because it will highlight everything in its context and you'll be able to understand the flow of this series. So before we begin, if you haven't subscribed already, please make sure you do so, and also click on the notification bell so that you are aware of all our uploads when they come out. Okay, so friends, in our final part, I believe I've covered most of them already, but again, this is from another angle so that you're able to follow the flow of what we are talking about here. So let's listen to what he says and let's answer it from the Bible.
The last reason why Seventh-day Adventists are wrong is not once is the Sabbath day commanded to be observed by those in the book of Genesis. Okay, contrary to what they teach, it was not given as a law until the Exodus. It was not given. You can't find it. I challenge you to look. You can assume, you can guess, but it was never mentioned.
Okay, so I must admit that there has never been a law mentioned as he mentions in his claim. But again, that doesn't mean that the law was never there. I mean, for when the Bible clearly shows in Genesis chapter 2 verse 3 the Sabbath day actually being mentioned, and when you see the law in Exodus chapter 20 where it was actually mentioned for it to be kept as a reflection of what was mentioned in Genesis chapter 2 verse 3, you can come to a biblical conclusion that the Sabbath was well known. I mean, how did Cain know that killing his brother was wrong when thou shalt not kill wasn't mentioned until Exodus? Or even Joseph, who knew that adultery was wrong when no mention of thou shalt not commit adultery wasn't mentioned until Exodus? You see, the point of the matter is, if you are putting down the toilet seat, you don't need a law or a sign to say put down the toilet seat, because you're already doing it. And what I mean is that you have to remember that Israel was in Egypt for 400 years of slavery, and naturally when you are surrounded by paganism, you are bound to forget the laws of God. And this is true because based upon the simple fact that when Moses went up to go get the 10 commandments, what were they doing at the bottom of the mountain? They were making a golden calf to worship God with. Now where do you think they got that practice from? Well, I guess from the place that they stayed for 400 years. So just because the law of God wasn't mentioned, it doesn't mean it wasn't there. And the best example of this, though the law of God wasn't mentioned, is what God said about Abraham when it came towards his laws. Genesis chapter 26 verse 4 says, "And I will make thy seed to multiply as the stars of heaven, and will give unto thy seed all these countries, and in thy seed shall all the nations of the earth be blessed. Because that thou, Abraham, obeyed my voice and kept my charge, my commandments, my statutes, and my laws." Alright friends, I pray that that's made sense. We're going to move on to the next part of what David says.
Even when Genesis chapter 6 verses 5 talks about the wickedness of man was great upon the earth, not once do we hear any mention of someone breaking the Sabbath day. We see mention of murder, we see mention of disobedience, and we see mention of homosexuality. That's not in the 10 Commandments, by the way. We see a lot of mentions of other sins, but not once the breaking of Sabbath. Why? Because it was not given. It was only given to Israel.
Alright, so again, you need to watch all the other parts because I believe I've already covered this. If you don't uphold the Creator God, you will automatically produce evil. And because that's based upon what we saw in Romans chapter 1, if you forget the Creator, you will have a reprobate mind. And we saw the principle of this held in the commandment of God, because the Sabbath day is a day that upholds the Creator. If you read the commandment carefully, the reason why we keep the Sabbath is because God is the Creator. He is the true and living God. No other idol, no evolution can vouch, should I say, for the creation of this world. It's only God. That's why the Sabbath is kept. Romans chapter 1 verse 25 to 29 says, "Who changed the truth of God into a lie and worshipped and served the creature more than the Creator, who is blessed forever. Amen." Then it says, "For this cause," or for this reason, "God gave them up to vile affections. And even as they did not like to retain God," or we could say the Creator, "in their knowledge, God gave them over to a reprobate mind to do those things which are not convenient, being filled with all unrighteousness." So it's because they did not follow the Creator, they didn't obtain God in their knowledge, why they ended up having corrupt and defiled mindsets. And I guess that also answers David's point when he said that the people in the antediluvian world in Genesis chapter 6 have an evil mind. it shows why they had those evil minds to begin with. Because if they kept the Sabbath day according to its principle, Genesis 6 wouldn't exist, because they would be worshipping God and not being given over to imaginations of wickedness. Now, it's important that we understand this because of the fact that there are many reasons why we say this happens or that happens, but we don't look at the root cause. For example, when it comes to Sodom and Gomorrah, we often talk about the vile things that they did. And though they were vile indeed, do we often talk about the root as to why they ended up doing those practices? No. And this is the point of what I am talking about, because if we look at the root of why they did these things, we could then say, oh, this is why they did it. Notice why they actually did these things, and you'd be surprised because some of the practices may be done from our very own selves. Behold, this was the iniquity of thy sister Sodom: pride, fullness of bread, which is gluttony, and abundance of idleness, which is not having anything to do but wasting time. And in her and in her daughters neither did she strengthen the hand of the poor and the needy. And they were haughty, committed abominations before me, therefore I took them away as I saw good. So think about it. Do you have pride? Do you think about yourself and what you want to eat and gluttonize? Do you care about nobody else but yourself and not even worry about those who are weak and those who need something? These are the roots that some of us may have that are the same sins that caused Sodom and Gomorrah to be who they are. And we would not have known this if we understood the principle of why they did this to begin with. So friends, it's important for us to look at the root of the commandment. Don't just look at it as keeping a day. There is more to it than just keeping a day. Look at the roots, because we can see it expressed in what we are going through right now. Alright friends, in part 4 I covered this. I hope you've gone back to watch the beginning parts, but part 4 is where I talk about this point in particular. But for now, let's move on to the other point in what David says.
And on top of it, not once is it commanded to be observed in the New Testament. Not even once in the New Testament is it mentioned as a sin for breaking it. Not even once. We see lists of murder, stealing. Now you might say, well, they already knew about the Sabbath day. Well, they already knew about murder. They already knew about stealing. They already knew about idolatry. Okay? Why is every other sin mentioned except the Sabbath day? I'll tell you why. Because of Jesus, my friends.
Okay, so what David is expressing here is that it wasn't mentioned in the New Testament. Now, based upon what I said before, if you're already keeping something, it doesn't need to be set forth as a law because it's already been kept. But be that as it may, I'm surprised that there were verses that were missed, which actually shows or establishes the point about the Sabbath and what Jesus mentioned himself. Notice this. Mark chapter 2 verse 27 and 28 says, He said unto them, The Sabbath was made for man, and not man for the Sabbath. And just a side point, because Christ created this world and created us according to Colossians chapter 1, it then makes sense what the next verse says. Therefore, the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath, or in principle, the Lord of creation. You also have other verses which says in Luke chapter 4 verse 16, And he came to Nazareth where he had been brought up, and as his custom was, he went into the synagogue on the Sabbath day, and stood up for to read. Paul kept the Sabbath, and Paul, as his manner was, went in unto them, and 3 Sabbath days reasoned with them of the Scriptures. The Gentiles kept the Sabbath day, and when the Jews were gone out of the synagogue, the Gentiles besought that these words might be preached to them the next Sabbath. Also what I covered in part 1, in Hebrews chapter 4, Paul expresses this as well. There remaineth therefore a rest, or sabbatismos, the keeping of the Sabbath, to the people of God. For he that has entered into his rest, he also has ceased from his own works, as God did from his. And the last verse I also want to express is what Jesus mentioned when the people would have to flee from Jerusalem well after he died and rose to heaven. Notice this. Matthew chapter 24 verse 20 says, But pray ye that your flights be not in the winter, neither on the Sabbath day. Okay, so I believe that's clear. The Bible does mention the Sabbath in the New Testament, but because it's not mentioned in thou shalt keep the Sabbath day, we have to be more logically sound than that, you could say. Letting the Bible and the context around it produce what it needs to be said. All right, let's move on to the last part.
Jesus is what it all pointed to. And that's why Colossians 2 makes it very clear that these were all a shadow of Jesus. Let no man judge you on a Sabbath day. Romans chapter 14 makes it very clear. One man thinks one day is better than the other man. Another man thinks all days alike. It doesn't matter. God bless you. You found many reasons, very biblical reasons, why the 7-day position is false. And if you're a part of the 7-day Adventist movement, you need to repent and accept the true gospel of Jesus Christ. Don't exalt the 10 Commandments, something that's done away with, something that his glory is less than what you already have. Preach the Holy Ghost, not the 10 Commandments. You don't need to preach the Sabbath day when you have the true rest, which is in Jesus. God bless you.
Okay, so lastly, he mentions Colossians chapter 2, verse 16 and Romans chapter 14. Now, in the past, I personally have spoke to many people about this because these verses, again, have been completely misunderstood. I believe David has been completely misunderstood with this one as well, but I'm going to give an explanation very, very quickly because I've actually done a full video on this already, but I'm going to give a quick summarization on these two verses. But again, the context is going to be in verse 14, so let's notice. Blotting out the handwriting of ordinance that was against us, which was contrary to us, and took it out of the way, nailing it to his cross. Now, the first thing I want to mention is this. The verse does not say blotting out the 10 commandments. It says blotting out the handwriting of ordinances. And it also mentions that was against us. And so the question then is, what is that being referred to? Well, Hebrews chapter 9 verse 1 expresses the ordinances that were linked to the sanctuary in the Old Testament. Then verily the first covenant had also ordinances of divine service and the worldly sanctuary. Now, what you need to understand is that the 10 commandments didn't mention anything about the sanctuary, but rather there was another thing that was handwritten, and that was the book of the law. And surprisingly, Colossians chapter 2 verse 14, when it mentioned the handwriting of ordinances that was against us, the Bible actually expresses that it was against us. Notice. Deuteronomy chapter 31 verse 26 says, "Take this book of the law and put it in the side of the ark of the covenant of the Lord your God, that it may be there for a witness against thee." So clearly we can see it wasn't the 10 commandments that were being mentioned here, it was the handwriting of ordinances that was written in the book of the law, which highlights all the sanctuary things as well as it being against us, the book of the law. But now we head into verse 16, which is often used by many Christians as well as Brother David Lynn to say that the Sabbath day is no longer needed to be kept because it's done away with. But let's now answer it based upon the context we've established in verse 14. "Let no man therefore judge you in meat or in drink, or in respect of an holy day, or of the new moon, or of the Sabbath days." So now looking at this verse on face value, you might think, okay, so I don't need to be judged on what I eat, I can eat anything. I don't need to be judged on what I drink, I can drink anything, and I don't need to keep the Sabbath day. But did the ordinance of the sanctuary have anything to do with what you ate and what you drank? No. So what did it mean? Well, I want you to notice where Paul got these wordings from and see the context of what that was said so that we can see what Paul actually meant, and keeping in mind what we got from the context in verse 14. Notice this. Ezekiel chapter 45 verse 17 says, "And it shall be the prince's part to give burnt offerings and meat offerings and drink offerings in the feasts and in the new moons and in the Sabbaths, in all solemnities of the house of Israel." Okay, so we can see so far that the meat wasn't what you eat, but it was meat offerings. The drink wasn't what you drank, it was drink offerings. The holy days that was mentioned were the feast days, and then you have the new moons. But what about the Sabbaths? And this is important, why you must understand what the book of the law was talking about, because we know that it wasn't the 10 commandments. So does the book of the law mention anything about Sabbaths? Because it does say Sabbaths with an S at the end, not singular. Well, in fact, it actually does. In the book of Leviticus chapter 23, it expresses many different Sabbaths that didn't even fall on the 7th day of the week. Some of them would fall on different days of the week, and guess what they were linked to? They were linked to the feast days. Here's some examples. Leviticus chapter 23 verse 39 says, "Also in the 15th day of the 7th month, when ye have gathered in the fruits of the land, ye shall keep a feast unto the Lord 7 days. On the first day shall be a Sabbath, and on the 8th day shall be a Sabbath. Notice verse 24. Speak unto the children of Israel, saying, in the 7th month, in the first day of the month, shall ye have a Sabbath, a memorial of creation? No, a memorial of blowing of trumpets, and holy convocation. Now this is just a quick rush of this verse, but if you look at the context of the verses, you can actually see what is being referred to in regards to the Sabbath. For it was not the Sabbath of the 10 Commandments, but it was the Sabbath of the ceremonial laws. The Sabbath of ordinances, or found in the book of the law, was pointed to all the ceremonial acts, whereas the Sabbath in the 10 Commandments, completely different from the ceremonial Sabbaths, was pointing to the Creator of heaven and earth. 2 different Sabbaths. And because each and every one of us are created from God, we all must keep the Sabbath because God is the creator. Alright friends, I pray that that's made sense. We're now going to head into the last verse that he uses, and that's Romans chapter 14. Now in the last point that we're going to go through Romans chapter 14, again, the context has to be applied. Romans chapter 14 verse 5, which David uses for this, says, one man esteemeth one day above another, another esteemeth every day alike. Let every man be fully persuaded in his own mind. But the question then is, what about verse 1? Because verse 1 sets the premise for everything else in that chapter. Notice what it says, and I'm going to use different versions just so you can see exactly what is being referred to. So I'm going to be using the KJV, the ESV, and the ERV, which is the easy read version. It says, him that is weak in the faith receive ye, but not to doubtful disputations. As for the one who is weak in faith, welcome him, but not to quarrel over opinions. Be willing to accept those who still have doubts about what believers can do, and don't argue with them about their different ideas. So then the question I want to ask is this: is keeping the Sabbath day a doubtful thing, in the sense to say, is it something that was not fully understood to do? No. The Sabbath wasn't a doubtful thing because it is part of the 10 Commandments, part of the New Covenant. I mean, it's easy for us to understand the context if we just read verse 1, and especially to understand what was happening around that time during that period. And what was happening during that time is that some people were condemning other people because, for one, they were not keeping certain days to fast, and as well, they were not keeping foods that they should be eating during their fast. A good example is the publican and the Pharisee, who exclaimed his holiness because he fasted on certain days. But friends, the Sabbath day is not a doubtful disputation. It's not a matter of opinion. It is the commandment of God, a commandment that God himself said, do not forget. And brothers and sisters, because I know my Creator, I surely will not forget him, because of the fact that I was created by him, as well as you being also created by him. Ecclesiastes chapter 12 verse 1 says, remember now thy Creator in the days of thy youth, while the evil days come not, nor the years draw nigh, when thou shalt say, I have no pleasure in them. Alright friends, for more information, please read Galatians chapter 3. It expresses people who have fallen from grace because they wanted to go back to keeping the ceremonial things which have no value, because the fullness of Christ has come and has fulfilled all those things, yet some people still wanted to do it to claim righteousness. But the point of the matter is this: we must understand the context so that we can understand the full picture that's being expressed. Now, I found this series vitally important because based upon what I studied in prophecy in the book of Daniel chapter 7 specifically, it talks about a power that will think to change times and also laws, God's laws in particular, because it wants to claim power on earth. And one of those things that it did was taking away the 7th day of the week to the first day of the week, and also changing idolatry so that idolatry is now justified to do. And that is the papal power, which has been referred to in Daniel chapter 7. I've recently completed a series called From Daniel to the Sunday Law, which goes from the book of Daniel all the way to the book of Revelation. Now please watch this series so that you know where we are in biblical history as well as biblical prophecy, and that will surely prepare us for the times that are coming. Alright friends, once again, thank you very much for watching this series. I pray that it's been understood. Again, this is not an attack on Brother David Lynn. I'm so blessed by his ministry, in the fact that he's reaching people for Christ. He's going out on the streets and reaching those who are in the highways and byways, as Jesus told us to do. Please continue to keep him in your prayers. But even on our road, even in our journey of life, there may be teachings that we may have took for granted and not fully understood, that we need to understand because it will affect us in the long run. And I more specifically want to make sure that this is an understanding of not you're wrong, I'm right. I don't want to boast in any kind of way. I want us all to come to that point where we're living up to the truth, because if deception is at an all-time high, we need to make sure that we are founded and grounded in the word of truth. Alright, thank you very much for watching, friends, and may God bless each and every one of you. Please subscribe, please share these videos, and I pray that we all come together to the experience of truth, because it is the truth that will set us free. Alright, God bless you all, and I will see you soon. Take care. Bye for now.